A sensitizer solution is required of 3% potassium or ammonium dichromate in distilled water. We now require a thickly coated gelatine sheet of paper around 5%. The gelatine coated paper is super dried over a heat source. This produces a mild reticulation, later aiding the pigmentation. The gelatine coated paper is now placed face up in a tray and the sensitizer applied. The tray is agitated constantly for 10 minutes, allowing the paper to become saturated in the sensitizer. The sensitized paper is now hung up in a dry, dark area. If done during the night, the paper will be bone dry and ready for use next morning. The paper, sensitized and bone dry, is now placed in contact with a large negative in a frame. The old gaslight printing frame is ideal, as the hinged back allows inspection progress during printing. Loading the frame should be done in low light or diffused weak light. The printing frame is now exposed to a UV light source. Sun lamp or daylight exposures are usually between 5 and 10 minutes. The frame should not face the sun directly, but from a shadow area. Otherwise, the image will be flat and low contrast. Keep turning the frame to allow even exposures. Printing now being finished, the print is, in subdued light, removed from the frame and placed in water. The object being to remove the dichromate, the bulk of which is quickly washed out. The print is washed for around 1 hour with frequent changes of clean water. The print, or matrix as it is now known, is now complete. It will be seen that the image now stands out in clear relief upon the wet gelatine and is now in a condition for receiving the ink. I judge the character of success from the appearance of the matrix at this stage. The greater the relief, the more readily the ink will take. A stiff ink with considerable tack, once described as like tar. I have always used Intaglio 1796 ink, stiffened with French chalk, about the size of a small pea. After working into a mass by picking it up with the palette knife and laying it back down again, spread as thin a layer as possible on an old tile. Using a stiff brush to start with, we charge the brush with ink from the layered deposit, Then redistribute to a clean area of the tile. The number one brush action, known as stippling or sweeping, is used exclusively to apply the initial deposit of pigment onto the matrix. The purpose of this brushwork is to lay down an even coating of ink quickly, thereby preventing future difficulties with the matrix inking up unevenly. To initiate the brush action, gently place the toe of the stag's foot on the top left corner of the image area. The ink-charged brush is then gently but firmly pushed down on the matrix, but not enough for the heel to touch the surface. There is a great deal of spring to the bristles and the brush will move down the matrix about an inch at a time. Do not lift the brush off of the surface, but release the downward pressure and the brush will spring back on its toe. At this point, push down again so that there is the effect of walking the brush down the surface of the gelatine without lifting it off the matrix. As the brush travels down the surface, there will be a slight deposit of pigment on the matrix. When the brush reaches the bottom of the image, lift it off the matrix and recharge it with ink. Then return the brush to the top of the matrix and place it where it will overlap the original deposit of ink. Now repeat the brush action as previously described. Continue until the entire surface is covered with a light deposit of ink. The next step is to turn the matrix 90 degrees and repeat the entire procedure. The matrix will be turned again and again after the surface has been inked, until the matrix has been turned 4 times. If a brush has been lightly charged with ink, when the procedure is complete, there will be an even deposit on the matrix. The total time spent on this initial inking should only be a few minutes. The number 2 brush action is the one used the most often in the oil process. The purpose of this brush stroke is twofold. First, to apply pigment to the matrix, and second, to remove pigment from the matrix. Begin by holding the fully charged brush firmly in a position that is vertical to the matrix, just as in brush action number 1. Approximately 1 inch above the gelatine surface and with a gentle stroke or light stippling action, allow the toe of the brush to touch and spread its hairs onto the matrix. It is important not to apply so much pressure as to allow the heel of the brush to come into contact with the matrix. Let the hairs expand and then spring off the surface, overlapping each brush stroke. This action, called stippling, is similar to that of a woman patting powdered makeup onto her face. Allowing the brush to remain momentarily on the surface leaves a greater deposit of pigment than when removing the brush very quickly. This is important when one desires to apply a heavier deposit of ink to a specific area. There should be no dragging action whatever, and the stroke should be carried out briskly but gently, with the brush making a stroke separately but close together, in lines to join up and ensure even inking. The only difficulty in making this stroke successful lies in the combination of brisk application of the brush and a slight check at the moment of impact to ensure gentleness in application. Also, the brush should be assisted in springing away at the end of each stroke, so that it does so smartly and is, in reality, snatched away. Fast dabbing occurs at a rate of about 6 strokes per second. To apply more ink, keep the brush down for a second and remove it slowly. The faster you lift the brush, the more ink it will lift off. This type of action is used in general inking with the brush charged with pigment. This action is also used without recharging the brush immediately following the preliminary inking, which was carried out by means of number 1 action. Used without recharging, this stroke will remove unwanted ink from the highlights and add it to the shadow portions. Thus, number 1 and number 2 actions can be used more or less alternately and so build up sufficient ink and contrast to ensure a satisfactory result. After some time, the matrix will start to dry out and start to clog the mid-tone and highlight areas with pigment. This is now the time to re-soak the matrix and bring it back into condition again for pigmentation. The matrix only requires a few minutes soaking in cold water. Also, the matrix can now be cleaned up in the mid-tone and highlight areas by gently tickling the surface of the matrix with a wad of cotton wool. And for more intricate areas, a sable brush which is slightly damp can be used in the same manner. After an hour and a half, the matrix is now ready to take ink in the mid-tone grey areas and the highlights. For this, I use an original Bromoil brush with bear hair. This will give finer detail and tone along with a different softer ink. After 2 hours, the print is now finally ready for transfer. First, a sandwich is made up by centering the inked matrix face down on the final support receptor paper. These 2 sheets are then placed with the inked matrix uppermost onto the bottom sheet. A top cover acetate sheet is then placed on top of the matrix. With the Autotype press, a single hand wheel controls the pinpoint inline pressure adjustment before the transfer can go ahead. The made-up sandwich is now carefully placed between the press rollers. Pass it through the rollers and back again using moderate pressure. constant speed is the correct procedure, and at no time during the pull should the handle rotation be interrupted. Remove the sandwich pack from the press and carefully open and remove the acetate cover. With a ruler, hold down the matrix end and peel back to expose the transferred image. Here I use a technique discovered in the 1930s by Bertram Cox, known as aerate. The matrix will be found to still retain some pigment by aerating for approximately 1 minute. This allows air moisture to build up on the matrix and receptor paper surface. After 1 minute then, carefully lay the matrix down upon the receptor paper. Relay the acetate sheet and once again close the sandwich pack. The sandwich once more is pulled backward and forward through the press rollers. Though I'm using here a traditional press made by the Autotype company in London, I should point out that any modern etching press can be used for this process. By analysis and deliberate reconstruction, the oil process worker can give birth to a completely new image, born like the phoenix from the ashes of the original creation. If the oil transfer printer is honest in his appraisal and reconstruction of the original picture, then a new and more virile graphic image will result.